the time, I will introduce our speaker and then hand the floor over to him. So today's speaker is Dr. Oliver Scott Curry, who is a research director for KindLab. He is also a research affiliate at the School of Anthropology and Museum Ethnography at the University of Oxford, and a research associate at the Center for Philosophy of Natural and Social Science at the London School of Economics, where incidentally he also received his PhD in 2005. And today he will be speaking about moral problems and give a Popperian approach. And with that, I am very glad to hand over the floor to Dr. Oliver Scott Curry. Thanks so much for being here.
Well, thank you. And thank you very much for that kind introduction. And thanks everyone for coming. I'm particularly delighted to be here and to get this invitation because and give this talk to fellow Popperians, because there's not many of us about, and you know, we need to stick together. And what I want to do today is to talk about my work on morality, which implicitly and increasingly explicitly has been informed by Popperian principles. And I want to show that, as usual, a Popperian approach to morality, as with other things, is a very fruitful, constructive one. When we, as Sam said, I'm interested in morality, in what it is, where it comes from, how it works, what it's for. Is it innate or acquired? How many moral rules there are? A whole range of different questions like this. And as we know, traditionally, these questions have been studied exclusively by philosophers in philosophy. But despite thousands of years of trying, philosophers still haven't made much progress towards answering these questions. They still can't agree on the basics. They can't agree on whether there is such a thing of morality or not, or whether there's one or many moral values, or whether it's whether morality is innate or acquired, or and so on. And I suppose my overarching thesis, my overarching claim is that that these questions can and should be studied scientifically. So although we think of these as philosophical problems for philosophers, they are in fact scientific questions for scientists. And the more we realize that and take that seriously and approach moral problems explicitly in that way, the more progress we'll make, the more constructive our moral discussions will be, and we'll be able to accelerate moral progress. So the more we take a scientific and therefore Popperian approach to these problems, the faster we'll move towards the moral truth. So let me start with like the biggest question: what is morality? And let me start with a big conjecture. The main conjecture is that there's nothing mysterious or magical about morality. Morality is merely a collection of cooperative solutions, a collection of biological and cultural mechanisms for solving the problems of social life that humans face over and over again. The basic idea is that the background to that idea is that humans are social animals. We've lived together in social groups for millions of years, and throughout that time and continuing up all the time now included, we face a range of different problems or opportunities for cooperation. And we have evolved and more recently invented a range of different solutions to those problems, ways of unlocking the benefits of social interaction. These solutions come in different shapes and sizes. Some are instinct, some are intuitions, some are cultural inventions, some are sort of formal institutions. But whatever they are, they collectively, they motivate our cooperative behavior, and they provide the criteria by which we evaluate the behavior of others. And the claim is that it's this collection of solutions, this collection of mechanisms, that philosophers and others have called morality, that have attached the label morality to. So I think I'm right in saying that although what is morality is not a particularly Popperian question, what I've tried to do is give a right to left definition, that there is all this stuff out there, there are all these cooperative strategies, and the claim is that morality is the label that we've attached to these strategies. For what it's worth, I'm certainly not the first or only person to make this claim that morality is fundamentally about cooperation. You can find examples of it in Plato and Hobbes and Locke and Rawls. And it's a kind of mainstream view in the contemporary scientific study of morality. So here's a range of active researchers: Jonathan Haidt, Alan Fisk, Michael Tomasello, Joshua Green, Kim Stoelny, and others, all sort of converging on this same point, that the basic function of morality is to promote cooperation. Now, technically, I should call this theory morality as stable strategies for achieving superior equilibrium in non-zero-sum games, but that's a bit of a mouthful. So for the time being, I'm going to just refer to it as morality as cooperation, or MAC for short. So that's what I mean. MAC, this theory of morality, that's a collection of cooperative rules, is I say it's a scientific theory because for a couple of reasons. One is because it makes use of nothing more than well-established findings in the natural and social sciences, and sort of consistent with everything else we know about the world. But also because it's a scientific theory because it makes predictions. It makes predictions about morality, the predictions about how we expect morality to behave, what we expect it to be made of, what we expect about the content and structure of morality. And I've listed some of them here. And what I want to do in the kind of this middle part of the talk is just to do a whistle-stop tour of some of these predictions and the relevant findings. So perhaps the most fundamental prediction of this theory of morality is cooperation is there'll be not one, because there's not just one but many different types of cooperation, we should expect there to be not one but many different types of morality, and we can predict what they will be. So whereas once it was a problem for evolutionists to explain why how cooperation could evolve, how organisms like us would ever be nice to each other, we're no longer in that situation. We now have a huge range of different theories of cooperation that explain different types of social behavior. And if anything, the problem is now trying to figure out which theory applies in any given case. So on this far oversaturated slide, down the left, we have seven well-established types of cooperation. There could be more. We have kin selection, mutualism, social exchange, hawkish and dovish strategies, division and possession, which I'll get to. The overall point is that in each case we have good background game theory, evolutionary game theory, explaining how these strategies could emerge and stabilize, how they could exist at all in principle. In most cases, we have examples of other organisms, other social animals behaving in these ways, cooperating in these ways. And we also have examples of plenty of examples of humans behaving in these ways. And in each case, we can find examples of the prediction is that if morality is all about cooperation and there's different types of cooperation, then it should be that those different types of cooperation are considered moral. And in each of these cases, we find these types of corporations, we find that's the case. So very briefly, the theory of kin selection explains why we love and care, why we feel a special obligation to protect and provide for them. Mutualism is simply the theory that individuals often do better working together than by trying to go it alone. There's strength and safety in numbers, and explains why humans form groups, why they value those groups, they value the membership of their groups, and they value joining together in sort of projects of mutual interest, and they resent individuals that split off from those groups, that weaken those groups, especially if they go on to join rival groups. Social exchange is simply the theory that we can overcome delayed mutualism or iterated prisoners' dilemmas by following a strategy of conditional cooperation, i.e. I scratch your back, you scratch mine, or if I do you a favor, I expect you to return that favor. And in humans, at least, it's implemented in has a whole range of sort of subcomponents to keep that strategy of reciprocity going. An initial trusting move, the experience of gratitude on the part of the recipient, or guilt if they can't repay. And if they can't repay, there's a motivation to make amends, to apologize, and for the original actor to forgive, to get the relationship back on track. So social exchange explains why we feel obliged to return favors and punish those who don't, for example. Meanwhile, the rest of these strategies are all different ways of resolving conflicts. So yeah, humans, like other animals, instead of when organisms come into conflict, they run a risk of wasting time and energy and injury in if it comes to an all-out fight. So many organisms try to avoid that by engaging, first of all, in ritual contests where they show off how tough they are. They show off their fighting ability through costly signals of prowess, of power, basically. And in those, many organisms, including us, resolve disputes through these costly displays, and in which the losers of the contest defer to the winners and withdraw, concede the fight and back out. So this combination of hawkish display of prowess and a dovish display of deference is one way that organisms resolve disputes. Other ways that are available are division. So when the disputed resource is divisible, we divide it or we share it fairly rather than trying to monopolize it. And another way of doing that is to recognize prior possession of a resource and defer ownership to whoever had it first. So in each case, for each of these theories, there's examples of humans and other animals behaving in these ways, and we can find examples of philosophers celebrating, for what it's worth, philosophers celebrating one or other of these cooperative traits, these cooperative strategies, as an important part of what it means to be moral. Whether that's Confucius talking about the importance of duties to kin, whether it's Royce talking about how loyalty is the crown of the virtues because it's only within collective endeavor that you can show any of the other virtues, whether it's social contracts theorists talking about promises and keeping contracts and reciprocity in general, whether it's virtue theorists, as for example David Hume talking about the shining virtues, the heroic virtues of fortitude, bravery, skill. These are ways that people display and maintain their status. And the flip side of that, what Hume called the monkish virtues of humility, respect, obedience, deference, abnegation, self-denial, quietism, and a whole range of other similar strategies that work, I'll say, that dovetail with the dovish traits, that dovetail with the hawkish ones. Of course, we can find philosophers celebrating the importance of fairness and as well as property rights and the prescription, the restraint from stealing. So each of those philosophers often think that their bit of morality is the most important bit. But if you take this broader cooperative view, you don't have to choose between these different components of morality. You can have them all. And equipped with these different theories of cooperation, we can explain different facets of morality. We can explain why humans pursue and value these different outcomes, why they, and to echo what I said before, each of these types of cooperation are immensely important. Hence, humans place an immense value on them. And it's these immense values that philosophers and others call our moral values. That's the argument. Okay, so let me just do a whistle-stop tour of some of the further. So one fundamental prediction of this theory that morality is all about cooperation is that there's many types of cooperation, and that we should find examples of sort of proto-morality in other social species, and we do. Another prediction is that people should, if morality is all about cooperation and these types of cooperation, then people should regard these types of cooperation as morally relevant and morally good. In order to test that prediction, my colleagues and I developed a moral values questionnaire that asks people questions about the relevance and importance of these different types of morality. And we found that yes, people did indeed place a moral value on these types of cooperation. And what's more, that their intuitions yielded the predicted 7-factor structure. So their moral judgments about these different types of cooperation varied in sort of 7 independent ways on independent dimensions, as we expected. And the resultant questionnaire, the moralities cooperation questionnaire, outperformed the Moral Foundations questionnaire, which is a similar but rival theory. Another prediction, and I'm happy to talk more about the empirical details of these at length, but I just want to give you like a snapshot just to kind of amuse smorgasbord and some amuse bouche, just to keep you going. Another prediction is that if morality is this collection of biological and cultural traits, then morality should have a genetic basis, as opposed to more blank slate views of human thought and behavior, according to which these traits would just be sort of learned rules. In order to test this, my colleagues and I administered that moral values questionnaire to a sample of 2,000 twins, and to look at the heritability and genetic structure of these different traits. We found, I'm going to show you another diagram here just to scare you a bit. We found, as predicted, that this morality was indeed heritable. There was differences in genes did influence differences in morality between people in our sample. But more to the point, we found genetic evidence for there being 7 discrete genetically influenced psychological structures. So let's call them moral instincts or moral modules, if you like. And what that means is that the morality seems to be subserved by not just one big general purpose mechanism, but the predicted 7 special purpose mechanisms, and that different genes influence different aspects of our morality. So the genes that influence how important you think fairness is, for example, are not the same as the genes that influence, are not identical with the genes that influence how important you think bravery is, or property rights. We also found some evidence for a general factor too that influenced all of the moral traits, but this general factor didn't have a genetic basis, which counts against psychological theories that rely on some general purpose learning mechanism. Right. Another prediction is that these moral traits will emerge spontaneously in the course of a development without explicit instruction, that to some extent these moral capacities will grow as and when they're needed. Individuals won't necessarily need to absorb them sort of passively. They're not like empty buckets of sort of learning by association from what goes on around them. That idea that morals are quotes innate obviously runs counter to lots of aspects of conventional wisdom, thinking that and some religious views that babies are born blank slates, or they're born bad and they have to be socialized to be good. That was perhaps once a tenable view, but it no longer is. This is not my work, but there's been, in the last decade or so, there's been an amazing growth in experimental research looking at, I was going to say what babies know and when they know it, but it's more what babies expect and when they expect it, and specifically how babies expect others to treat one another, and in the sense of what violates their expectations of behavior. So there's been work showing, for example, that kids in the age of 5 expect family members to treat each other better than non-family members. From 1.5 years old, kids expect members of the same group to show each other preferential treatment. From I'm having to move my pictures around. From 5.5, their kids are already demonstrating reciprocity in sort of mini experimental games. Kids under 1 year old expect little characters to defer to big characters. But my favorite example, the fairness in the fairness case, kids as young as 4 years old, when they're watching a puppet show in which the experimenter gives either there's 2 puppets and the experimenter gives them 1 cookie each, or just 2 cookies to one of the puppets. Kids as young as 4 months old can detect and are surprised by that unfair outcome, that violation of their expectation. They're surprised when one puppet gets 2 cookies, and yet they show no difference if if in the absence of puppets, the experimenter just puts 2 cookies on one plate and none on another. So there's something about the social interaction that they notice and are surprised by from 4 months old. And from 4 years old, kids expect, they recognize that whoever gets something first, they have a right to keep it. So none of these experiments are, I've just found out what dispositive means. So none of these experiments are dispositive that show that these traits are innate. It's possible in theory that nevertheless somehow these kids are learning these rules in some way. But obviously the earlier we see these glimmers of social and moral cognition emerging, that the less likely it becomes they've had opportunities to learn anything, and the more likely it is that these are growing spontaneously, as indeed the previous genetic evidence would suggest. And this, at the moment, these are as it were, the upper bounds. These are the upper limits of when these traits come online. Further experiments, it would be good to see a set of more consistent experiments using the same method across all these different traits. Are only going to, it's only going to be, the ceiling or whatever is only going to come down. The first appearance is only going to come down with further investigation. So babies are good. Another prediction of the theory is that if it's the case that morality is all about cooperation, then these cooperative traits should be considered morally good, as we saw, and this should be the case all over the place. This should be the case universally across cultures. Again, this has been obviously a long-running philosophical and psychological discussion. Are there any universal absolute moral values, or does morality mean different things in different places? The debate's rumbled on largely because there's never been any good evidence that could resolve it one way or another. So my colleagues and I decided to try and find that evidence, or try and test the theory that these traits were considered moral all over the world. What we did was went to the archives, the human relations area files which are online but are based at Yale University. And what we did was we analysed accounts of ethics from 600 sources from a sample of 60 cultures that had been previously chosen to provide as representative a sample of humanity as possible. And we tested the prediction that when and if these traits were described or referred to, whether they were, if they had a moral valence attached to them, we tested the prediction that this moral valence would always be positive. In contrast to the, let's say, moral relativist view that these moral traits what would be considered morally good would vary substantially across cultures. And in the more extreme view, like as John Locke argued, that we should find examples of cultures where some of these cooperative traits, perhaps they're just valued in the West, but they're not valued in the East, or they're considered bad in the East or the West or the North or the South or whatever. Again, there's a lot of data generated by this project, and I just want to give you a very quick overview. Essentially, what we were trying to do is fill up this, or see how far we could fill up this grid with the 7 types of cooperation down one side and the 60 cultures along the top. What did and we're interested in a few things. We're interested in when these traits were given a moral valence, was it good or bad? How were these observations distributed, and how were they distributed? Were they prevalent? Was it the case that we found lots of examples in lots of places, or were there just a few examples in a few places? And also, how were those observations distributed? Were they just in the North or the South or the East or the West, or what? Well, what did we find? We found examples of most of these moral rules in most places, with some exceptions. And most of the gaps are due to general gaps in the coverage of these different societies. Again, there's lots of details to discuss, which I'm happy to come back to in the discussions. Here's a few examples of these. Basically, what we found were just the same rules cropping up over and over again all over the world, on opposite sides of the world. So despite, so in a sense, this is a very robust test of the theory, despite scouring the world for counterexamples to the claim that these cooperative traits would be considered morally good. We looked everywhere, as it were. We found none, and no one's pointed any out since. We presented this work at a conference of social anthropologists a couple of years ago, and despite much huffing and puffing and consternation, not one of them in the room was able to come up with a counterexample of some far-flung society that would refute or even provide a single counterexample to this general claim. So a robust test of the theory and a robust corroboration, and we have further work in progress looking, spreading the net even further to machine read all the other ethnographies to again to take another look for any possible refutations. I should emphasize that it's not a prediction of the theory that, and indeed it wasn't our impression, that moral values and moral systems will be identical across cultures. On the contrary, it's a prediction of the theory that moral values reflect the value of cooperation and of these different types of cooperation. So different people living in different societies with different cooperative opportunities should show different moral values, or should prioritize different moral values. If you live in a traditional society where most of your interactions are with family and with a relatively small, stable group, then the values of family values and group loyalty will loom relatively large in your system of values. If, however, you live in a, well, I could say closed. If you live in a closed society, that's what you might expect. If you live in a more open society, where more people are living, as it were, on their own in little boxes in cities, and they interact relatively little with their family and a stable group, and they're more interacting with strangers, then we might expect the values of family values and group loyalty to decline relative to the values of fairness and reciprocity, for example. We have another project in the field at the moment, putting that theory to the test, and the results are looking pretty good, but I won't go into the details just now. Okay. Another prediction, or at least sort of possibility raised by this approach, is that it's possible, if there are these simple basic moral values, it's possible that these, or let's call them elements, then it raises the possibility that these simple elements raise the possibility that morality might be a combinatorial system, a system in which these simple moral elements combine to form a large number of more complex moral molecules. So combinatorial systems are ubiquitous in nature. Matter is a combinatorial system, DNA is a combinatorial system, language and cuisine and music are combinatorial systems. And these systems are surprisingly powerful. So with a handful of musical notes, you can generate trillions of different tunes. In that system is located every possible tune that has ever been played or could ever be played, is somewhere within that that sort of set of combinations. So we wondered whether morality might be similar in that this small number of elements might generate this vast galaxy of potential moral concepts. In order to investigate that, my colleagues and I in a paper just out in review of, it's either a review of psychology and philosophy or review of philosophy and psychology, I can't remember one of those. We as an initial test of this idea, we went to see if we could find examples of moral concepts that combine these two basic types, of which, as you can see, there's 21 different types. So we're interested in trying to find, is there a moral concept, for example, that combines the idea that it's good to love your family with the idea that it's good to help your group? Is there an idea that combines it's good to return favors or avenge injuries, and the idea that it's good to be brave, to be heroic, and so on through all of these different combinations? The short answer is we succeeded. In each case, we found a plausible candidate combination of these two these two basic types. So for example, what happens if you combine the idea that you ought to be good to your family and you ought to be good to your group? Well, you get the idea of fraternity, or you ought to help your group by treating them as if they were family. And this is related to ideas of fictive kinship and blood brotherhood, and I think there's an Arabic concept of milk motherhood, of individuals that get milk from the same, unrelated individuals who get milk from the same mother have some special bond. And here in the picture, I forget where they're from, but there's two warriors mixing their blood together to symbolize the fact that they'll now treat each other as brothers, as blood brothers. What happens if you combine the idea of you have special obligations to your family and the idea that you should defer to your superiors, you should defer to high-ranking individuals? Well, you get the idea that you should defer to high-ranking members of your family, i.e., classically, you get the idea of filial piety, the idea that sons should show a particular reverence and respect for their fathers. What happens if you combine the idea of exchange, of reciprocity, in this case negative reciprocity, and hawkish heroism? Well, you get the idea of honor, the idea that you display your power and bravery by avenging injuries, by not letting any slight go unanswered. Again, that's obviously a widespread moral concept, and so on. In that project, we just looked at 21 those second order moral molecules, those 21 moral molecules. But of course, in principle, you could keep going. You could look for combinations of 3, 4, 5 or more elements. You could look at not just combinations of the positive, cooperative, moral elements, but the negatively valenced, uncooperative, immoral elements. You can look at combinations of positive and negative moral elements. You can assume that these different elements make different contributions to these molecules. And anyway, the point is that when you do the maths, you find that there could be hundreds, thousands, perhaps millions of possible combinations. So this approach to morality, this morality's cooperation, is the first and only theory to make genuine predictions about what moral phenomena might be out there in the world, not just in terms of those basic elements, but also in terms of their combinations. And as such, this framework can be used to explain, incorporate, and reanalyze familiar morals. It can be used to guide the search for unknown or unfamiliar or overlooked morals, as the longer version of this talk goes into some of the other molecules on that list. And it could even spur the generation of novel molecules, novel combinations, moral ideas that have yet to be invented or imagined. It also provides a different take on how and why cultures might vary. Perhaps it's the case that the moral elements are innate and universal, but the molecules are learnt and local. Perhaps different people in different places have come up with new recipes, have combined different elements in different ways to come up with different complex moral systems. And that's one of the ways in which cultures vary. And so on. Okay, we're nearly there. Finally, on this kind of whistle-stop tour of works in progress, everything's a work in progress. This theory also, this morality's cooperation also gives you a theory of moral dilemmas, of moral conflicts. So far, we've been looking at, I mentioned just before, how these different basic ideas might combine. Exactly the same theory gives you an overview of how these different moral principles might conflict, how you might have to, situations in which you might have to choose between them. You might have to choose between helping your family or helping your group. You might have to choose between helping your friends or refraining from stealing or whatever. So it gives you I want to say a bingo card of possible moral dilemmas. And some colleagues and I have another project in the works at the moment, developing this sort of systematic set of moral dilemmas that we want to use, and we think it would be interesting to use them to investigate what are the prevalence of these different types of dilemmas in people's lives. What are the prevalence of these moral dilemmas in, for example, the am I the a-hole thread on Reddit? And how and why do people make different decisions, choose different options when they're in this situation? Okay, so in summary, I said at the beginning that if you morality is incorporated as a scientific theory, it makes a number of predictions about how the nature and content and structure of morality. These whole huge range of these predictions have been put to the test, and so far they have passed the test. And it looks like that morality is indeed this collection of, it's our attempt to cooperate, this collection of cooperative strategies, of cooperative solutions. Putting this this work aside, so on that basis, I want to proceed into the last shorter part of the talk, just to consider what are the implications of this scientific account for how we ought to behave, of what is the moral thing to do, what is the right thing to do. And I want to say it's fairly straightforward. Given that morality is a collection of cooperative rules or strategies, whatever you like, then obviously acting morally involves acting in accordance with those rules. It means following those rules. To put it simply, it means that if you want to be moral, then you ought to cooperate. You ought to love your family, be loyal to your group, return favors, be brave, defer to superiors, be fair, respect others' property, and so on. And if and when those principles conflict, as they do in the case of moral dilemmas, then you ought to choose the more cooperative option, the greater good. Done. Because if it is true that morality is this collection of strategies, then all of this follows. And what this approach says is that when people are making moral decisions, in effect, what they're doing is asking, what is the cooperative move to make in this situation? What's the most cooperative move I can make? And that, of course, involves analyzing the situation, the problem situation, to see although intuitively you might intuit that you're facing a moral situation, a potential cooperative opportunity. Ideally, you would analyze the situation and see, is this a case of kin altruism, or is it a coordination game, or is it a hawk-dove game, or some combination? People are considering the alternative options. What moves are available in this situation? And for that, they're drawing on their instincts, their intuitions, their customs as candidate hypotheses for how to solve these problems, candidate solutions for what to do in these situations. Now, it is the case that some of these available moves will solve the problem better than others. Some of them will. Some behaviors do promote cooperation better than others. In game theory, this is called an equilibrium selection problem. So it follows that these moral problems, qua cooperative problems, are empirical problems. They are problems that have objectively correct answers, even though, as usual, there's no guarantee that we'll ever figure out what they are. But we can move close to the truth, close to the moral truth, in the usual way, by employing standard scientific method, by analyzing the situation, by identifying potential solutions, by criticizing and testing those solutions, perhaps sort of simulating them, thinking through the consequences of particular cooperative traits, or indeed putting them into action and seeing what happens. Better still, we don't have to stick with the morals, the solutions that nature or culture have given us. We can and should and do try to invent new and better solutions to our problems, strategies that get us to a higher equilibrium. And indeed we have in history, and we're doing it all the time. For example, a few hundred years ago, we invented the idea that instead of paying so much attention to hierarchies, why not treat people as equals and see what happens? In some cultures, but not others, they've stumbled. I don't know if British people think that they've invented queuing. I haven't seen good empirical work on this, but the idea of a queue, let's allocate resources on a first come, first serve basis, as opposed to being a mad scramble. Let's suppose it's a cultural invention, and to the extent that it solves a problem better, it reduces the friction of conflict better, and raises us to a superior equilibrium. Some of these solutions, some of these novel hypotheses will work. Some of them will solve a problem better than what went before. And when that happens, when we stumble upon or invent or just discover a new solution to our cooperative problems, and then we make progress. That's what progress is made of. That's what moral progress is made of. As I found this nice quote the other day, so we should do the best we can until we know better, and then when we know better, we should do better. So given that morality is our attempt to solve cooperative problems, and given cooperative problems are empirical problems with a correct answer that we can strive towards through the usual scientific process, then conventional wisdom is wrong to claim that you can't go from is to ought or from facts to values. You can go from facts to values if you start with the right facts, if you start with facts about or discoveries about the nature and content of morality. Indeed, that's the and by demystifying morality in this way, by demystifying moral decision making, I think that we can bring this process out into the open. We can and make our moral discussions more constructive, make them more transparent, more amenable to criticism, and in doing so, we can accelerate the pace of moral progress. So, of course, we can approach morality in this way, and I think the burden of proof should be on philosophers who, when faced with our most important problems, refuse to use the most successful problem-solving machinery we've ever invented. They refuse to use science. What possible justification could there be for doing that? Okay, so I've showed that if you take this scientific approach to morality, then you see that morality is no mystery, can be studied scientifically, and I've argued that as a result, we now understand that morality is all about cooperation, that there's many different types of cooperation, hence many different types of morality. These moral types have a genetic basis, they're early developing, psychologically distinct, and cross-culturally universal, and they vary across individuals and across cultures in predictable ways. These moral types can combine and come into conflict, and there can be scientific answers to these questions, scientific answers to these moral conflicts. And ultimately, if you want to be good, then you ought to cooperate. So let's waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be. Let's be one, or good person. Thank you very much. Very happy, really looking forward to your critical commentary.
Thanks so much for the talk. Yeah, I will give you some real virtual applause. There you go.
Thank you very much.
And yeah, so now we have a Q&A session. I will go to gallery view. And I'll just kick it off with first couple of questions. So when you say that your theory is scientific, do you mean that you could disprove it with observation? Or do you mean that it is scientific given that certain basic assumptions you can then corroborate your view by looking at different cultures?
I'm not sure the difference, but yeah, I mean, any and all of those predictions could have been falsified. So in the cross-cultural one, for example, one theory is that these traits would be considered moral everywhere. Another theory is that there'd be huge variation in whether these traits are considered moral. And some people have argued that there would be no universal morals. So yeah, when we when we scoured the planet looking for counterexamples, we really stuck our neck out and maximized the chances of us finding, actively searched for refutations, and yet couldn't find any. So certainly that aspect of the theory, all the aspects of the theory are testable and could have come up differently. Yeah.
And do you think that there is morality beyond cooperation? For example, if someone is stuck on an island, is there such a thing as the right or wrong choice for that person?
So again, it does. So first of all, it doesn't matter what I think. What matters is what the theory says. And this particular theory says no, that all morality is always and everywhere a cooperative phenomenon, and so there won't be any moral phenomena that are not the products or byproducts of sort of a morality is just the name we give to these cooperative strivings, these attempts to unlock non-zero sum values all around us. So as to whether so I mean, so the short answer would be no. There wouldn't be morality on a desert island if there's just one person, because there's no opportunity for cooperation. Although that's such an unusual counterintuitive situation, many of the behaviors that we normally think of as influence others, I'm sure we'd have a similar reaction to. Or to put it a slightly different way, some people have argued that, well, yes, there might be more to morality than cooperation, and they've given examples of what they call self-regarding duties to self, to keep oneself clean and healthy, and to work hard and develop your talents, and to not commit suicide and things like that. So those could be counterexamples, but I suspect, and I don't know the answer to every possible question, but I suspect that on closer inspection, those traits are traits that make people useful to others, make them useful members of society. So keeping yourself healthy and fit and developing your talents, it is cooperative in that way, because you make yourself a potential cooperator.
Doesn't that run into an infinite regress? Because in the way I was thinking about it just before, is that you have the people who cooperate are better off, and that is why individuals should want to cooperate. But now it seems, correct me if I'm wrong, from what you just said, that cooperation is kind of, it comes before that. It's individual values are less important. It's cooperation that really matters. I don't know if I was able to express what I thought was a paradox succinctly, but does that make sense?
I'm not sure I got what the paradox was. I mean, another way of putting the idea is that humans value a whole range of different things. Some of those value, including they value cooperative opportunities with others, or successful cooperation with others. And it's that subset of values that we call moral values. So it's cooperation that demarcates the moral sphere from the non-moral sphere.
Right. I think if I were to rephrase it, I would maybe say something like, in what you were just saying, where people groom and they keep themselves healthy because that is a better way of perhaps that is good for cooperation. Doesn't that then run into the problem that at some point, like, some things have to be valuable for the individual just for their own sake? Like, they might be doing things completely separate from other people just because they like to and they think it's valuable. And I would have thought that cooperation is one of those things which they do because it brings them value. But if there are no behaviors which people do just purely for themselves, then where is the value in cooperation coming from?
Well, so there's certainly things that people value that are not cooperative. I mean, if I value if I value red wine more than white wine, my choice doesn't have any influence on any. If I choose red wine for dinner tonight rather than white wine, it doesn't have. That's just my preference. It doesn't have any implications for anyone else. The question is, why do some apparently, certainly there are non-cooperative, therefore non-moral decisions to make. The question is, why are some of those things that might look like purely individual decisions, why are they sometimes considered moral? Why are they like why are they considered, why are these apparently personal decisions considered moral? And the argument is that, well, actually on closer inspection, those particular cases do in fact set you up, are in fact cooperative, do have an influence on on other people.
Right. Then let's see. Yeah, I think maybe this is a good point where I can ask the audience if anyone else has a question for the speaker. If so, you can raise your hand and I'll give you an opportunity to talk. Otherwise, I had another question. I see there's some questions in the audience. Okay, I'll save my question for later in that case. Crowdis,
yeah.
Please go ahead. Yes.
Yes, thank you. Fascinating talk. What do moral philosophers say, or how do they respond by, for instance, asking how does this theory solve, let's say, the trolley problem, which is a problem they love? What would your approach be there?
What do
well, it's, I mean, it touches on utilitarian versus deontological rules. What's the right thing to do if you somehow, if you have, it's a moral conflict problem essentially.
Yeah. So let me answer in an abstract and a less abstract way. So this approach to moral decision making is what I would call a cooperative approach or a cooperativist approach. What it says is that in general you should choose the stable cooperative strategy that produces the most benefits. And it seems to me that traditional moral theories, normative theories. So it's a decision making. It's a moral decision making process, and those previous moral decision making processes, like deontology or utilitarianism, just take one or other aspect of this broader theory and take it in isolation, and then run into a number of predictable differences. So if you're a deontologist and you focus exclusively on the stability of the strategy, is this a strategy that can be adopted universally? Then then yes, you've glimpsed part of the correct view, or these older theories have latched onto some of the correct aspects. But if you focus just on the stability of the strategy without any regard for the consequences, then you have no mechanism by which you can choose which of the infinite number of stable strategies to proceed with. Similarly, if you ignore the stability of the strategy and focus exclusively on the generating maximum benefits, as utilitarians do, then not only do you have a sort of huge intractable problem that is difficult to resolve, but you also end up advocating solutions that are unstable, that are too onerous, too demanding, that this won't work. So, and similarly for some of the other contenders. So this cooperative approach, I think, can explain why those older theories, can explain the content of those older theories, and it can also explain or predict why they run into the problems that they do, why they're criticized for ignoring consequences, or why they're criticized for or being too onerous. Exactly how all this plays out in all of these trolley problems, I don't know what the exact answer is. I don't know the answer to all the I don't know the answer to every possible moral question. But what I do know is that this theory, and probably not exclusively, predicts there will be some problems in which the what's the word? Each of the outcomes will have, each of the strategies is sort of equal, as it were, and you should be indifferent between the different outcomes. So it predicts there will be some situations in which there's nothing to choose between the various options. Mm-hmm. And I think that a lot of it's unfortunate to the extent that psychological research keeps going until it finds problems to which people are indifferent, such that their responses are more or less random. That's not progress and not particularly informative.
Okay, then I see that Neil Hudson has his hand raised, and maybe before that, because the slides are still open, I think the video will be a bit compressed, so would it maybe be possible to close the slides?
Yes.
There we go. Thank you. Then yeah, Neil, please go ahead.
Yes, thanks, Sam. Yeah, very interesting talk, although I want to be a little bit of a devil's advocate, if that's okay. I saw on the fraternity slide that you had a quote from Robespierre, who, if my history serves me well, has a little bit of a checkered reputation. I think I may be right in saying he was one of the instigators in the French Revolution of an awful lot of executions and so on. And I suppose my challenge to the whole paradigm here isn't the construal of morality as cooperation a kind of tyrant's dream? Because all the tyrant needs to do is denounce someone who's getting in their way as being uncooperative, and such a tyrant would start to make progress.
No. How is that any different from someone saying, a dictator saying that someone is what's the word? This is of disutility or anything else? I think another way of putting it. I thought you were going to ask a different question. I want to give an answer to that, but
well, go ahead. Tell me how you interpreted the question. Perhaps you understood where I was coming from better than I did myself.
But wait a minute, is it a dictator's dream to be this? I mean, well, so certainly it might be the case rhetorically that someone could, if we understand how the more we understand about how our moral intuitions work, certainly rhetorically, it becomes perhaps easier for someone to press our buttons and someone to manipulate us into thinking that such and such a person or such and such a group is bad. For all these reasons, and I think implicitly that's what happens anyway, and certainly they might be able to do it more easily if we had a better understanding of how our moral psychology works. But it doesn't mean that so certainly people could abuse this knowledge, but it doesn't mean that they would be right to do so. On the contrary, to the extent that they use this knowledge to cause conflicts or to launch attacks on other groups, to be uncooperative to others, then they'd be being immoral, but according to the theory.
Well, except it, but maybe this is what Sam was getting. I don't know, but when Sam was struggling to express his point about infinite regress, I mean, cooperation to what end? It seems to me that just to kind of reverse my point of view or the way I pose the question, one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. So where is the place in this theory for ultimate ends or ultimate values which stand outside cooperation as merely a means to an end to the achievement of those values?
Well, the ultimate values don't stand out there in the cosmos. The ultimate values are there from the beginning. So humans have a range of wants, and they have discovered that they can satisfy more of those wants by working together, by cooperating. Hence, they place a commensurate value on the importance of cooperation, and that's what we call morality. But it's certainly so. The question of what's the right thing to do is always relative to a particular situation, particular problem situation, a particular interaction. And it's certainly, and this is what I thought you were going to ask before, it's certainly the case that, as it were, local cooperation could be globally uncooperative. So it's certainly the case, robbers can cooperate to rob a bank. Robbers could be, there's honor amongst thieves. They could be loyal to one another. They could trust one another. They could be heroically jumping through the window or something. They can display all of those. They could have all those genuine moral feelings. They could be cooperating in pursuit of an uncooperative end. But what we do when we make a judgment of that is that we don't just take into account the interests of the robbers. We draw back and we take into account the interests of everybody affected by that behavior, including the bank, including the people whose money in the bank and everything else. And so on balance, we say, okay, well, we can understand why the robbers' psychology would have been firing in that way. But on balance, when we zoom out from that, we see that it was an uncooperative act, and so we judge it to be immoral. We judge it to be wrong. And I think it's
okay. So I don't know, Sam, if you'll permit me one more question, if that's all right.
Go ahead. Yes.
Are there lots of other hands raised at the moment?
No, go ahead.
Okay, so I'm going to add one point then, and I mean it is the Karl Popper Society, and obviously one of the modern exponents of Popper's work is David Deutsch, and I think I don't know if he's on the call, but if I understand his work correctly, one of the points he would make would be, there's a kind of moral priority to fostering the conditions for knowledge creation. So and of course knowledge creation, one might say, on top of a genetic substrate. So your analysis, if I understand it, essentially derives from the insights that, even from a very young age, there are, at least seven kind of categories that are presumably to some degree genetically programmed into humans. And from what you say, that seems very, very well supported from your work. But is there a place over and above that substrate for what one might call the sphere of ideas, and indeed innovative ideas?
Yeah. So yes. In a sense, it's almost, in my mind, and I'm working this out as I go along, but to my mind, it's almost the ideas come first. So the potential for cooperation, as soon as you have little critters, the potential for cooperation exists already. As soon as two living things bump into each other, there's a potential for cooperation. So that comes first, and then the question is, how do we seize those opportunities? Where do the solutions to those problems come from? And I think of this in a very Popperian way. I think it's very similar to what he said in general, that so anyway, fast forward from the primordial ooze up to us, but up to our primate forefathers and mothers. Our sort of early moral ideas are intuitive, are implicit, are instinctual. We don't really, and they're sort of shrouded in myth and mystery, and sometimes religious superstition. We don't really know why we feel the way we do. We just think this is right, that's wrong, and we get on with it. And those implicit innate theories have stood the test of time. They're pretty good, but they're certainly not. There's no guarantee that they're optimal. There's no guarantee that we couldn't come up with better solutions. And I think that the history of civilization shows that we can and do and have come up with better solutions. We have invented novel ways, new ways of cooperating, novel solutions to the problems, and that's what. And I think that we're, sky's the limit. So I think that this Popperian approach does lead you to the view that the the search for new and better ways of cooperating, of making moral progress, is a, is an unended quest, and we should keep searching for a more cooperative world.
Thank you.
Then there's several questions in the chat, and there's also Eamon. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I'll read the questions in the chat first, and then I'll give you the opportunities to ask your question, if that's all right. Great. So there's two questions from David. One of them is, can you give some counterexamples that would, sorry, I will just read it out exactly as it states here. Can you give us some examples of what you would consider counterexamples for your theory?
Well, I'm just going back to the list. I'm trying to find my list of predictions, but I mean, what would be counterexamples? So I have got a slide with a whole load of counterexamples on, but you've told me to turn it off, but I can bring it back. But right. I mean, if there was some, what would there be? So if there were genuine non-cooperative things that were considered moral, would be, so the theory is that all moral phenomena are cooperative. So any moral phenomena that were not cooperative would obviously be a problem for the theory. The theory is that there'd be, I can't quite parse it in this way off the top of my head, but if we were to discover new types of cooperation, if the game theorists would say, aha, I've discovered there's this strategy, then that would be a way that, I mean, the theory doesn't say there's only 7 types. The theory says there's at least 7 types, and we might discover more. So if we discovered more, and if we'd had this conversation, 50 years ago, I would have been saying, so far there's 4.5 types of cooperation discovered. Anyway, if you discovered an 8th type, then that would obviously update and revise the current version of the theory. It would extend it. If there were the additional sort of auxiliary hypothesis that there's some innate roots to it, if we found that there was no genetic basis, these traits weren't heritable at all, that would be contrary to that aspect of the theory. If we found some non-trivial number of cultures where it was morally good to kill your family and betray your group and be a coward and, I don't know, monopolize resources or something, then that would be counter to the theory. I could keep going.
Right. And then a second question was, highly critical people are generally considered uncooperative. Is it immoral to be critical?
Oh, yeah. Oh, that's a good question. Well, yeah, that's a good question. So it would be wrong to think of sometimes people, it would be a mistake. I'm not saying the questioner made this mistake, but it would be a mistake to think of cooperative as sort of thinking of being compliant. So cooperative as in just being agreeable, just going along with what other people want. It doesn't mean that. It means pursuing cooperative strategies, and cooperative strategies are mutually beneficial, so they have to be beneficial for the actor as well as the recipient or recipients. So it's not about being a pushover; it's about pursuing these different strategies. So if you are being critical in the sense that you are criticizing a particular proposal for how to solve a cooperative problem, and you're sort of awkwardly pressing for a new and different solution, then that's a little bit risky, and there's people are understandably risk averse to try new things, could all go wrong. But if that's what you're trying to do, and certainly if you are successful, then again globally that would be it's morally good to do that. I thought that was gonna turn out to be a slightly different question. In terms, some people ask, what about autonomy and freedom? What about the moral status of these traits? And again, I don't have a definitive answer to that. my hunch is that freedom and autonomy and liberty and all that those sort of things, what they mean, what in effect they are, what I'm going to say mean anyway, what they mean is freedom is the freedom from other people's cooperative schemes. So it's the freedom not to get roped into what other people are up to, and it's the freedom not to be made to over cooperate, to obviously we tend to, when we think about cooperation and morality, we think about people being not cooperating enough. So the impetus is always we should have more of it. But the theory says that you can have too much of a good thing, you can over cooperate, you can contribute too much, you can make yourself vulnerable to exploitation, and so on. So I think freedom is about cooperating. It's about freedom from over cooperating, and it's about sort of coming down to a more optimal level, I think.
Right. Then, yeah, Eamon.
Hi, thanks. Great talk, Oliver. Thank you.
Thank you.
Actually, the last thing you just answered was a segue. I was actually wanting to ask about freedom and independence. I was born in England, raised in England. I've lived in the US for 27 years now, so I've spent most of my adult life over here. And there is a huge emphasis on liberty and freedom, and much more than in the UK. So culturally, and the way that I've resolved it is that when we're children, we learn cooperation. We learn it with our parents, with our families, with our siblings. We learn it with our friends on our street. We learn it in our schools. But I would argue, this is a challenge to you, that and I'd really love to hear your response to this, that the goal of a parent is to teach a child to be independent by adult age. So whether it's in America, it's considered 21. So for example, if I was born in a highly conservative environment or highly religious environment, and there were 1,000 people around me, and 999 of them said Islam is the way to go. It's cooperation. From what you're saying, I would read that as I'm better off not speaking up. I'm better off just being cooperative, and even though I don't agree with those views, I shouldn't speak up. So I would submit that liberty and independence is a very strong moral value to attain. But then I would agree, this is where I come back and agree with you, that once you become independent and a free thinker and an individual, then you willingly choose to cooperate because that is the highest value, collaboration and community and culture. But coming from a place of independence as opposed to coercion or codependence or dependence, do you have any kind of ways to help me unpack this with your, because I really like where you're going with the 7, I don't know what you call them, foundations, but building them up.
Domains.
Yeah. You can help me unpack that.
Yeah. So so one of the other results. So one of the other results of that genetic study is that parents have no influence over your morals. So I forget. Is that right? No, sorry. I'm thinking of a different study. Have relatively little influence over your morals, and certainly other work in the area shows that parents have little to no influence. So about, roughly speaking, in general, a third of the differences between people in how pro-social, how kind they are due to differences in genes. About 2/3 are due to are unexplained variation, but the amount due to differences in parenting is close to 0. In our study, it was a little bit more than that, but it's surprisingly small, given that many people seem to think that kids get their morality from their parents. They do, but just genetically not. They don't learn it from them. So that's a kind of empirical thing. In terms of, yeah, I don't know. It sort of goes back to what we were saying before, that free thinkers are a bit awkward, and they throw a spanner in the works. And sometimes that spanner turns out to be exactly what everyone needed, but it's difficult to know that in advance, and it's a little bit risky. So it's understandable that it's understandable that people want to stick with the things that have always worked, and they're reluctant. We've always eaten these mushrooms, and I don't really like your idea of trying that new mushroom over there. So, I mean, in general, that makes sense. And to try something new could jeopardize your current cooperative scheme, and it's risky. So I think it's understandable, and I think that, but sometimes it works. And I would imagine that, I think it's the case that cultures vary in how much they tolerate free thinking, how much they value exploration as opposed to conformity. And I guess there should be, I'm just trying to think this, I guess the optimal is that the optimal way of doing it is for there to be safe spaces to think radical ideas. There should be, experimental labs where we can try ideas out in a safe environment before we go large with them. I think, does that answer your question?
It does, and I think what you just, the last part was, that's what social media is. It's basically, these are moral dilemmas. Politics are moral dilemmas. They're what ought to be, and everyone has an opinion on it. And essentially that fabric it seems to be really going away. And I'm such a huge proponent of civil discourse, and I think you called it safe space, just finding someone you disagree with and communicating with them. That's very hard to do. I think what I'm struggling with, if I can just go back to the original point, is it comes across as tribal. If you're saying cooperation is the highest good, the highest value, my fear is that, I think if you look at politics right now, in a two-party system like there is in the UK and the US, fundamentally in the US it's much worse. But I would submit that you ask anyone on both sides and you'd say cooperation is the highest good, they would all agree. That it's called United Kingdom for a reason, and United States of America, you want unity. But there's something that's tribal right now in politics. And I'm struggling with your methods and your morality as you've presented it, that it doesn't solve that. It doesn't. For example, I said I'm raised in England, but my parents are Palestinian. So how does that solve fundamental? Because morality, surely, if morality should do one thing, it's to bring us together, to solve conflict. And I don't know if cooperation is the highest value for that.
Well, I mean, I hazard to try and explain politics as well as morality in this talk, but my working hypothesis is that morality is all about cooperation, and politics is all about conflict over which cooperative schemes to pursue. And obviously different people benefit from different cooperative schemes, so they disagree about, we should build a bridge over there, no, we should build a harbor over here, or we should subsidize this, or no, we should subsidize that. So it's conflict over basically how to cooperate, conflict over how to spend the public purse. Basically, everyone chips in, and then we disagree about what to do with it. And that conflict in general can be, I think there's some good political science on this. Like, it sounds really nice for everyone to agree, but given that there are genuine disagreements about what to do with the public purse, having everybody hold hands and say kumbaya might not be particularly constructive. You do want an arena in which you do want a loyal opposition. You do want an opposition that can scrutinize what the government's doing and replace them and everything else. So the conflict is inevitable. What you want to do is try and minimize the cost of that conflict and direct it in as constructive directions as possible. So you want the conflict to be who's got the most support, who's got the best ideas, who's got the best evidence, that's what you want it to be. You don't want it to be who makes the loudest noise, who's got the most, whose army is biggest,
Right.
who can shoot, so, and obviously institutions like parliaments, jaw is better than war, but sometimes they break down. Sometimes
Yes.
that doesn't resolve the conflict, and we resort to warfare instead. We have civil wars or whatever. So I think conflict is inevitable, but we want to, and competition for status is inevitable, but we want to always direct them in constructive directions rather than destructive directions.
Excellent, thank you. That really actually cleared it for me. Thank you.
And me too. Thank you.
Then, are there any further questions? Perhaps I have another question, which is that, do you think that we're still producing moral theories in the sense that we have these atoms that you talked about, and you said that maybe there's a possibility that there will be an 8th atom that we will discover, but yeah, are we still actively producing these, or do you think that they are kind of mostly set?
Are you asking me whether I can predict what we're going to know in the future?
Well, I guess I'm asking whether we are, in some sense, I guess, because
yeah,
if we're not going to be, if we're not going to produce any more of them, if we're not if this isn't something open to criticism and research, then.
Well, there's a couple of things there. So one is, could we discover an 8th and 9th and 10th sort of basic cooperative strategy? And of course we could. And I've got an inkling of what one of them might be, but I'm not sure yet. There's a lovely book which I'm going to forget the name of now. Anyway, the subtitle is a periodic table of games by Robinson and Goforth, and there's some nice. I've tweeted GIFs, kind of infographics from them before. According to, in that book, and according to game theory, there are hundreds, thousands, almost infinite different types of games, and it seems to me that the almost sort of cycloptic focus on Prisoner's Dilemma is preventing people appreciating all the other games that are out there. So, about 90% of the published work out there is on Prisoner's Dilemmas and Tragedy of the Commons, which is the same thing. It's completely obscuring all the interesting stuff that goes on with coordination games or conflict resolution games, and so on. And in that book, they say there's hundreds of different games, and they try and impose some kind of taxonomy on them, and they say there's at least sort of 12 families of games. It's not all of which are non-zero sum, but many are. So I certainly think there's that literature has yet to be fully mined for other potential types of cooperation and cooperative strategies. So in that sense, they certainly could, and I expect there would be more types of cooperation. In terms of people coming up with novel ways of cooperating, novel morals, then yeah, again, I think sky's the limit, anything's possible. But that doesn't necessarily involve inventing sort of new basic types. Like I said, it could involve combinations, new novel combinations, of which there are hundreds and thousands and maybe millions. And it also involves sort of new things made possible by technology in ways that weren't there before. This is a random thought, but I was reading the other day about about oaths, and about how keeping an oath was a very important moral concept in, that's Per has the book. Keeping an oath, keeping your word, being a man of your word was an extremely important value in, for example, in ancient Greece and in among the Vikings, and I imagine that's what I happen to be reading about, but I imagine this more broadly. And that seems a little bit quaint to us. We get the idea, but it seems a little bit quaint. One of Zeus's jobs was to punish people who broke oaths. And I was thinking about why don't we care about that much? Why don't we care about that so much anymore? And the answer is because we don't live in a world of purely verbal contracts anymore. If that was the only thing, like if my promise, I promise to do this for you if you do this, if you do that for me, or I promise I'm going to go and slay that dragon or whatever. If you live in a world where those promises are purely verbal, then it's extremely important and valuable to have a reputation for keeping your word, because then people will trust you to do the next thing. We don't live in that world anymore now. We have, you can't buy a tin of beans without signing a contract about it. And we have credit cards that give us credit without having anyone to have to believe us. So the idea someone would make except for rare formal, like in court and things like that, the idea that you have to give an oath is anachronistic now. And that's because we have technologies of trust that we've invented things, new ways of solving problems that supplant those old traditional ways of solving problems. And in that sense, I think there's an infinite number of ways we do and could use technology to enhance cooperation.
Very nice. Okay, thanks for your answer, and thanks again for the wonderful talk, and thanks everyone else for the nice questions. And
yeah, thank you all.
It was great.